I don't care about infrastructure anymore.
Right.
And that's crazy because that's all they used to care about.
It's a massive mindset change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was your job as the operations manager, was to manage the operation of the infrastructure.
Yeah.
Containers, serverless, observability. Information technology is changing so rapidly that we may not recognize it in a decade. But what exactly could this future look like? We sat down with Greg Campion, a baritone voice cloud engineer here at Paessler, to get his views on it.
So why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself, Greg?
So I've been a systems administrator, or I was a systems administrator for about 10 years before. In 2016, I moved into the cloud department here at Paessler and been doing cloud development since then.
Okay, so that means when we talk about the past, you worked in infrastructure when it was,
relatively old, yeah. I mean, since 2006. So I mean, I get the really, really old administration and stuff like that. I didn't really do, but
right.
Yeah.
And obviously a lot has changed since those days. Back in those days, we were just talking about more traditional elements like routers, servers, basic networks.
Yeah, I mean, just bare hardware. So you basically had, your bare metal, and that ran, one server ran one application and so on. And as I started getting into systems administration is when kind of the virtualization revolution was really starting to take away.
Okay.
So primarily VMware. And so the first company I worked for, we didn't have anything virtualized whatsoever. And then the second company I worked for, they were cutting edge back then. And they were migrating everything to virtual machines.
Right.
And so we had, farms of, I think it was like 15 to 20 racks that were running servers, and every single server was running VMware. And so, each VMware server was running then our web application at different levels with load balancers in front of it and so on.
Yeah. Yeah, VMware brought a lot of changes to the traditional IT infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, it completely revolutionized it. I mean, that's why VMware is such a huge company even still today, right?
Yeah.
It's like, along with Hyper-V, there's a lot of different virtualization technologies, but what really took hold in the corporate world was obviously VMware.
Yeah.
But just the idea that you could have multiple applications running on a single server changed the name of the game, because, traditional applications, they couldn't actually really use a whole box. Right? So you'd have, peaks and valleys constantly, and so you pay tons and tons of money for a server, but you're really only effectively using it maybe 5% of the time if you're lucky, right? But there was just no other option, and so that's what you did. And so, you had to actually buy a server that was able to handle those peaks.
Okay.
So you buy something with, back then, 50, 60 gigs of RAM or something like that, which was enormous, right, to run, say, your Exchange server. And then you'd have peaks, and it could hold those peaks out, but 90% of the time on the weekends or whatever,
it's just sitting there.
1% usage, and you paid all this money for those hardware, you're not really using it. And so virtualization, VMware, allowed you to basically run multiple applications and load balance across, right? So you could buy 4 of those types of servers and run all of your applications on it, and depending on what application was using the most resources, or you could allocate basically the memory and the CPU usage accordingly to the application, and then you had a more consistent usage of the hardware that you've been paying for, which again was horribly expensive.
Yeah. So that was the big revolution to more traditional IT infrastructure, leading to where we're now. Where are we now? What's the present picture?
And the present picture is basically we took bare metal and then we abstracted it to VMware. VMs. And so from VMs, what we've gone to now is to containers, and beyond even containers, we've gone to what they call serverless, or functions as a service.
Okay. And a lot of the current IT environments now, current day, they're tending more towards a hybrid environment.
Yeah, you pretty much have to at this point. So in traditional, architectures or whatever, you had, your single server, and so you'd say, all right, this one single server that's running Exchange, what's the CPU load, what's this, what's that, right? And you could tell, okay, so my Exchange server is running, which means that Exchange is most likely running, right? And so you'd set up something like Nagios to check, specific points of over SNMP, basically, like what's my memory usage like, what's my CPU usage like, things like that. And as we abstracted that to the VMware, basically then you were saying, okay, that server is running, but it could be running any number of applications. So you couldn't definitively say, because that server is running, that application is running, right? And so you kind of had to also add in some monitoring aspects of, okay, which actual applications are running, or which VMs, because a VM is a self-contained system, right? It's the entire operating system with everything on top. And so now basically a lot of companies are running VMware still in-house, either because they haven't migrated the applications or they don't want to for privacy reasons or whatever. And then you have a lot of companies that have said, you know what, that Exchange server, that is our biggest time spend for IT, let's let Microsoft do it, and then they ship that off to Office 365. I mean, Azure and Microsoft's cloud business is gaining by leaps and bounds because of Office 365.
Right.
And it makes a lot of sense. I mean, honestly, Exchange was what no admin really wanted to touch. I mean,
they had to do it, but no one wanted to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I tell you honestly, like my second boss, actually, my second job as a sysadmin, he told me, he's like, you can do anything in a systems administration. He's like, never become an Exchange admin. He's like, because if that goes down, everybody's on you.
Yeah.
And if it's up, it's just standard business, right? Nobody notices it.
Yeah.
Nobody notices that hero Exchange admin who's actually keeping everybody working. And so it's kind of like being a goalie or something like that in sports.
No one notices you until you
mess
fail.
up. Exactly. And so yeah, it's taking all those kinds of applications and moving into the cloud. I mean, there's tons of options now. I mean, it's not just an Exchange server that you can do that with. If you have a Kubernetes cluster that you're running, you can take that and just say, you know what, AWS, run that for me, or Azure, run that for me. And so again, you're abstracting kind of the levels of compute to other companies effectively, and that's the whole idea behind cloud, right? And so I think a lot of more modern companies, or especially new companies, I mean startups and stuff like that, why would they even want to build a server room? I mean, why would they want any kind of rack space at all? It doesn't really make that much sense, because it only really starts making sense financially if, and this is depending on your architecture, of course, it only makes sense financially to run your own data center if you have a massive workload. But if you just run a few VMs, you're going to set up a server with VMware and so on and so forth. It doesn't really make that much sense. Again, considering privacy and things like that. Sure. But it's much easier and much quicker. I mean, within 2 clicks, you have a VM running by Azure, by whomever, any cloud provider, and it's literally seconds. Yeah. So it makes a lot of sense.
Okay. But this hybrid environment does mean that IT admins have some challenges, for example, with managing what might be seen as a traditional on-premises network and things that might be in the cloud somewhere. I mean, there's challenges that come in with managing and monitoring that, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, when you start talking about hybrid systems, it's, all right, now you have a system internally that may be running whatever application. So you have a VMware cluster that you have to monitor internally. That's one piece of it. But then you also have all these VMs that are running in the cloud, say, right? And it could be that VMs are able to migrate between the 2 locations, for example, right? So how exactly do you say, okay, how do I monitor this application that's moving in between? You don't have any access to that underlying hardware anymore, right? So you can't say, yeah, that server that's running my VM by Amazon has this much CPU load. It's not possible, right? It's abstracted away. And so you have to kind of figure out, all right, at which level do I need to then monitor this VM or this application that's running on the VM? And that's kind of where monitoring has to start going, because and a lot of it has to do too with like customer expectations. It's not so, like, if you can't really get away with just saying, hey, our server farm is down at the moment, or something like that. Like, customers just expect things to be running all the time. Like, in the last 10 years, the expectations have grown exponentially, that everything's up 24/7, they always have support, and so on and so forth. And so as a result, it's you have to figure out some way to monitor that user experience rather than the actual object itself.
Okay. That leads nicely into our discussion about the future of IT infrastructures and where we're headed. So we've come from the traditional on-premises to a more virtualized environment to the hybrid environments we're seeing now. Where are we headed? Because we're already seeing some of this new IT landscape already. Where are we headed in general? I
mean, what I've seen at least trending, and I think that most people would say the same, is that everything is going either to containers or to serverless architectures. So there's a few companies out there like a Cloud Guru, DAZN is one also here in Europe. They run 100% serverless, and they offer, like, DAZN is basically like Netflix, but for sports, for example. And they are 100% serverless. So serverless means essentially that they write functions, they write business logic that interacts with other components or other services that are offered by a cloud provider, but they're never touching the operating system level. Okay. So they're just writing business logic at that point. Right. And so, yeah, that presents obviously its own set of challenges in terms of monitoring.
Yeah.
The same with containers. It's where everything's kind of slowly heading towards, at least it seems like it, there's a definite trend, is that the infrastructure, the underlying infrastructure of what runs your application is becoming less and less and less relevant. What's really important for your business nowadays is, do I have an internet connection and can my computers get to the internet? And if they can get to the internet, then you're good,
then
right?
You're fine, yeah.
You just have to be able to access the cloud. And so, from an on-premise perspective, that's pretty much that's what I see the future going towards is, you're going to always have some kind of physical stuff. You're going to have
you got printers, you're
going to have desktops, you're going to have switches, to get internet connectivity, you're going to have your Wi-Fi access points and stuff like that. But the traditional, all right, I got 2 racks in the basement like we have here, eventually that's probably going to disappear.
Yeah.
And so, the future of monitoring is figuring out how to change that paradigm of, all right, I'm monitoring my infrastructure and that's what monitoring means to me, and more, these are the applications that my users use, and how do I make sure and ensure that they're up and running.
Right. We've already seen lots of moves to that because, companies are already, like you were saying, getting rid of their data centers. Even companies that traditionally had data centers are now getting rid of them.
Yeah, my brother-in-law works at a company. They had 3 different, data centers. Full-blown, huge, thousands and thousands of servers data centers. Yeah. And one day, the CEO just said, we're moving everything to AWS.
Okay.
And all the data centers got shut down. I interviewed at a company a lot of years ago now, but I was going to be a technician at a data center for them. And they are now 100% on AWS. They gave a huge presentation actually at the reInvent this year.
Okay.
And so, it's kind of a cost value thing, but it's also what do you want to focus on?
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, what I've noticed now being in the cloud engineering team here is we can develop an application, get it up and running, and have it production ready with very, very, very low overhead in terms of actual operations. So again, we're not having to set up servers, we're not having to set up internet connections and making sure that we have failovers between different data centers and blah, blah, blah. Amazon does that all for us. And that's the appeal behind the whole thing, right? You can do that yourself, but in a lot of cases, you just have to ask yourself why.
Yeah.
And if you're working on a team of 5 or 6 guys, you don't have the overhead, you don't have the bandwidth to really be able to do that anymore.
Right.
You could, but again, there's this expectation from users now that there's going to be new features built into your application, into your system, almost daily now. And you see this in applications that we have on our phones, where you're constantly getting updates, and that's because this overhead of having to manage the infrastructure behind those updates is gone, and so the developers can focus on, here's my business logic, here's my feature, build it in, rapidly push it out, and you're good.
So essentially what you're saying is in 5 years or 10 years time, we won't care about infrastructure at all?
I've been hearing that at a few different conferences I've been to. I've been talking to people about it, and I've talked to people like operations managers who are just like, I don't care about infrastructure anymore.
Right.
And that's crazy because that's all they used to care about.
It's a massive mindset change.
Yeah, absolutely. That was your job as the operations manager, was to manage the operation of the infrastructure.
Yeah.
And now that's shifting towards, all right, the infrastructure itself doesn't really matter. Somebody else is taking care of that. We have to make sure that our application is running, or that customer-facing interface is up and running and pleasurable to use for that customer.
Right.
And that's what's becoming more important.
Okay. You mentioned the whole containers and serverless. Is it kind of a battle between the two, or are they something that complement each other? Is it something that containers will lead to a serverless situation?
So, containers were the first level of abstraction, and now basically when we talk about service or functions as a service, those are containers, essentially, right? The difference is when I'm running a container, I still have access to the underlying operating system.
Okay.
Whereas with functions as a service, you kind of have some tentative or tenuous access to the operating system, but it's a very much sandbox solution. And the idea that the to compete is something that's I think kind of popular right now, but I think it's a bit of a discredit to both.
Right. It's not like a Betamax versus VHS situation.
It's not. A lot of people treat it that way. A lot of people say, it's like no Betamax, no VCR, it doesn't, or VHS rather. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. There's workloads that make much more sense on containers. There's workloads that make a lot of sense on serverless.
Yeah.
And it also depends on your load. There's a lot of variables and factors that go into it, and it's kind of like the debate between tabs and spaces. I don't want to start a flame war, but
oh my god,
yeah,
another video.
Yeah. No, you're talking about two very similar technologies that the serverless is actually built on top of containers.
Okay.
And so as a result, like I said, there's some situations where serverless is absolutely warranted and makes a lot of sense. It also allows for extremely fast prototyping and developing of new systems, which is really cool. But at the end of the day, you're going to get to a point where serverless may just cost you too much money if you're running at such a workload.
Right.
There's ways to optimize that, like companies like DAZN have done. It's our A-Cloud Guru. They have thousands, hundreds of thousands of users probably at this point. And they run 100% serverless. There's ways to do it, but you have to have a very forward-thinking, very modern team who is really studying it, because the evolution of serverless right now, the evolution of containers is having at such a rapid pace.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to keep up with.
Yeah, and that's also the thing. If people had asked 10 years ago what the situation would be like now in 2019, not many people would have foreseen where we are with things like containers and serverless.
Not.
So who knows what the situation will actually be in 10 years with new technologies that may pop up in between.
Yeah, I remember working for this company about 3 years ago when one of our colleagues came up to me and he's like, "Hey, have you heard of Docker?" And I hadn't really heard of it yet. And I was just like, no, I don't know. And he's like, oh, check out these containers. I was like, oh, that's kind of nifty, it's whatever.
I can see that catching on.
Yeah, and now it's like, all right, 3 years later, and it's completely pervasive.
Yeah.
We're using containers all over the place in our company now for, CI/CD, for testing, for running workloads and things like that. And it's phenomenal technology. It's really, really empowered developers to do what they do best.
Okay.
So
You mentioned earlier about the traditional monitoring philosophy. In the past, monitoring would focus on premises.
Up, down.
A word that's popped up a lot, I guess, in relation with the new technologies and the new things that are happening with IT infrastructure is observability.
Right.
Can you tell us more about
So,
how you see that?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a buzzword. But to give it credit, just like DevOps has become a bit of a buzzword and everybody defines it a little bit differently. The thing is when you give something a title, when you give something a noun, you're able then to have a discussion about it and have everybody kind of at least try to be on the same page about what you're discussing, right? So if we just called what kind of, let's say modern monitoring has become, if we just continued calling that monitoring, it's a bit of a misnomer.
It misses the nuance of what's changing.
Yeah. And by giving it a name, you give it a bit, I don't know if you want to say a bit of power or something like that, but you're able to change the discussion about it, right? And so, as I said, traditional monitoring was up, down, is this full, is that full? If you're setting up a Nagio system, it's like, all right, here's my SNMP ID, and here I can read this data, and then
what's my usage and
thresholds
so on.
and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about modern applications, when you're talking about containers and serverless and stuff like that, where things are headed, then how do you make that observable, right? And that's, I think, where encompasses this whole observability name. Different people have defined it differently. Twitter's got their 4 pillars of observability. There's, if you read up on the internet about the 3 pillars of observability, there's all sorts of pillars and things like that. But at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is make your system, make your application observable.
Yeah.
And so again, if you're running this thing through function as a service or through containers or whatever, and you don't have access to some of the data that you normally would, you have to ask yourself, okay, how do I make this observable? Well, the way you do that is by telling your application, either pulling data from your application through things like Prometheus, or have your application actually pushing data out of it through logging, through tracing, things like that, right?
Okay.
And so by doing that, you make your application more observable in that you have basically, you're storing data in a highly cardinal way. So every single user request gets logged. And normally, if you have a database, what you want to avoid is high cardinality, right? You want to have a unique ID for each individual data point, and you don't want to have 500 of the same exact ID for 500 different data points.
Right.
Well, observability actually really is reliant on high cardinality, that you can say, all right, for this one specific user, I'm indexing on this user's, say, user's ID, right? And I want to know exactly what that user's experience has been in terms of latency and lag and whatever else, right? And so through a truly observable system, you're able to analyze that data per user or per web server or per container or whatever. And that's where like logging comes in, that's where tracing comes in, where you can actually then go through your application and say, all right, this guy had this problem here. Why? Okay, I can trace it back to here, and then I can trace it back to here, and then here I can actually see the logs from that system and analyze what actually went wrong on that system for that specific user request. And maybe it was just a one-off thing that we can ignore. Maybe it's something that's systemic that's going to really bite us later on down the line. But the point of it is that you're making the application in and of itself observable instead of just observing the system itself.
Yeah, the old metrics don't mean anything.
Right, and it's all about like passive and active monitoring, right? Or passive and active observing, so to speak.
Greg, my next question is, with all of this stuff, the containers and serverless and where we're clearly right now, where it seems like we're heading. How long do we have before we have the situation that you're saying infrastructure won't matter to us anymore? I mean, we're already seeing it, but how long before all of this comes to real fruition and we're really...
I mean, if you're talking about like, the old kind of stodgy, huge enterprises, they're probably not going to go completely containerized or completely serverless or whatever for probably 15, 20 years. Again,
we have like a decade or two.
Yeah, I mean, it's for the really big companies, the ones that don't move very quickly, let's say, it's going to be a long time before they can fully, because you're going to have to migrate all these old applications that people are using to these kinds of infrastructures. And I've heard a lot of talks from people who are doing those kinds of things, but it's a difficult process. But I mean, in terms of like where that becomes kind of the mainstay, or like for medium-sized businesses or new startups and stuff, where that's kind of the de facto standard is containers and serverless, I would say within 5 years.
Within 5 years.
So
then to wrap up, how do companies, how do sysadmins, how do people currently in IT, working with IT infrastructure, how do they prepare, or are there concrete steps that they can take already now, or is it just a wait and see?
I mean, being in IT, you kind of always have to be prepared for what's coming next. I mean, you always have to be educating yourself and keeping on with the newest trends. Again, like I said, 3 years ago, I remember talking to this colleague about Docker, and at the time I was just like, probably just gonna be a trend, right? It's just gonna be some fad that's gonna die off, and I was obviously blatantly wrong. But even though, all the same, even though I thought that at the time, I still did my research. I still looked up into it. I still tried to figure out what exactly do they mean with containers, and try to understand that new layer of abstraction. And so I think that's the best thing people can do at this point is, there's tons of resources out there about learning these things. Amazon's got free tiers for all this stuff, so if you want to just play around with it, do it.
Just sign up and do it.
Yeah, it's just taking, an hour or two at night or something like that to just try to build a fully serverless application to see what happens. And then once you've built that, you really kind of understand the pain points of like, okay, how do I monitor this? Like how can I actually figure out what's going wrong if something does go wrong, right? And you start understanding because obviously every single new technology has its own challenges, and serverless is, it's by no means an ideal, perfect technology, nor containers. They're constantly evolving. But the best way to prepare for it is just by messing around with it and using the resources that are out there.
Yeah, get educated.
Yeah.
Great, Greg. It's been very interesting talking to you. Thanks for your time. I think we can all say that the real star of this interview is your shirt.
Yeah. Pause.
Thanks for joining us. It's been really good.
Thanks, man.
And if you want to see more discussions like this one, hit the thumbs up button. If you haven't yet subscribed to our channel, we'll also be publishing a related blog where Greg will tell us more about what we've discussed here. So check out our blog and watch out for that article. We'll see you next time.